So good afternoon and welcome everybody. I am Fabrizio Di Ribotti. I am the current Vice President of the European Economic Association, and it is my greatest pleasure to chair this lunchtime session focusing on undergraduate education in economics. This is the first conference session organized by the EEA Education Committee, which is chaired by Professor Margaret Bray from the London School of Economics. Let me say a few words of introduction, very short. This Congress demonstrates that economic at the research level is something very exciting, but it is a fact that we sometimes fail to communicate this to our students. Another important consideration is that we feel often under pressure from our universities, from the media, government agencies, and society at large about our role in forming the future economic elites. A common criticism, for instance, is that we transmit to students values that are not conducive to socially desirable outcomes, excessive self-interest, lack of social responsibility, etc. This criticism is often superficial and naive, or it comes actually from a misunderstanding of the actual content of what we teach. Yet, I feel that we are often weak in making our case, and perhaps sometimes we are insufficiently receptive of legitimate demands on overly conservative. So, to discuss this and other themes, I would like to introduce this very highly qualified panel consisting of, Margaret Bray, who will make some further introductory remarks, Wendy Carlin from University College London, Sergei Guryov from New Economic School and Sciences Po, and Paul Seabright from Toulouse School of Economics and Institute for Advanced Studies in Toulouse. So I suggest a tight format because we have many speakers and 1 hour. So every speaker gives, after Margaret's remark, will give a 10 minutes introduction. And at the end of this, the floor will be open for questions, and then we'll have some concluding remarks. Please, Margaret.
Well, as Fabrizio says, this is our first lunchtime session. The EEA, but through its education committee, is becoming more ambitious in what it does to support us in our role as educators, broadly conceived. And this is changing, and it's changing because economics is changing, and it's also changing because of major disruption. Now the internet is beginning to not just provide students with information or often misinformation, but also presenting scenarios which are a radical challenge to traditional universities. And I'm delighted to have my colleagues with me who will be addressing some of these issues.
Thank you very much. So let me get started. What I'm going to do is to talk about teaching Introduction to Economics, so the first course that students would take in economics, as if the last 30 years had happened, and by that I'm referring to what's happened over the last few decades in economics as well as what's happened in the world. What we can do, I think, is we can take advantage of the new results that we have in economics, and you want me to have this closer? Okay. That we can situate the economy in its historical, social, and environmental setting, and we can bring, for example, the new results from behavioral economics, from experiments about the role of human behavior beyond Homo economicus, as Fabrizio was suggesting. We can now deal with incomplete contracts in labor and credit markets. We can talk about how to model dynamics, including disequilibrium, and what I think we can do now is to actually provide a kind of seamless connection between the microeconomics of incomplete contracts, economic rents and dynamics, and what we want to teach students in macro. Something else, a big development in our subject over the last couple of decades, has been the new results from economic history, and we can use those together with much better empirical methods that we have now as a testing ground for a really rich variety of economic questions. And what the project that I'm going to tell you about is that we are building a new Intro to Economics course on these foundations. So what's the core project? This is a project funded by the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York. And what it is, it's a new course, beginning course. It's not a book, it's not a MOOC, but it's a free, online, fully interactive resource. And we think it's going to offer to all of you out there who are going to be stepping up to teach intro a new way of teaching economics. We're aiming to close 4 gaps. The first one I've already sketched, which is the gap between what we do as economists and what we teach our students, what we now know. The second is between the questions that the students come to us with, to which Fabrizio alluded. And the third is between the traditional methods of teaching, textbooks, lectures, and so on, and what's now available with new teaching technologies. There's a fourth gap as well that we can close, and this is the gap between price and marginal cost, which we should care about as economists. And there you can see the price of the latest new, about to hit the streets intro book, $272.40. And what we are going to be offering is priced at marginal cost of 0. So a beginning student would start here. This is the website interface that all of you will be able to log on to free in a few weeks' time. And this just runs you through what the, how the website operates. We begin with this long historical data set. The interactivity allows us to have pop-up glossary entries, definitions available for the students. We bring inequality into the analysis in their very first introduction to economics, give a simple, intuitive definition of the Gini Coefficient. They can highlight, take notes. We define the Gini Coefficient for 2 people about how a pie is split. Once you've written down the formula, then you actually get to see the pies. So you can see the spectrum of measures of inequality using the Gini. So let me try to sketch in the time I've got and to just give you some images, really, of what we're trying to do in this course. The first idea is to use just a few models that we can use in a whole number of different settings. So here we introduce the use of the feasible set and indifference curves to talk about altruistic and selfish preferences. Here we use exactly the same kind of structure to talk about the price-setting firm. Here we have a bargaining situation, and down the bottom we can introduce the trade-off in the form of the Phillips curve and the preferences of policymakers. The second is to use another kind of device to get students thinking very early on about how forward-looking behavior comes into economic the way to think about the economy. So the one on the left is the price-setting firm, thinking about the duration of unemployment. And then here's the perhaps more familiar timeline with income and consumption. And we've got consumption-smoothing households and credit-constrained ones. The other big thing we're trying to do is that for every concept that we introduce in the intro course, we should have some empirical basis for it. So the chart, which you can probably see much better than we can see it here, is data from the 19th century on the growth of real wages. So, yeah, the growth of real wages and the fall in hours of work. So we use that to motivate individual decision-making, choices between free time and goods, and the impact of technological progress. I'll go through these other ones much more quickly. This is volatility, again, using historical data, contrasting volatility of GDP growth with the size of government. We introduce behavioral experiments. These are farmers and students playing the ultimatum game. And this is a way of introducing institutions that I'll come back to in a moment. I will swiftly move through the logic of the course. We begin with long-run data sets. This is the so-called hockey stick of history of GDP per capita from the year 1000 that I showed you a minute ago. We've got lots of these hockey sticks. This one's about the speed at which news travels. What we've done is to try to make use of the online, the interactive technology to bring economics alive for students in their first course at university. So we've a series called Economists in Action. Some of you have already been recruited, others will be. This is the first one. The economic historian and economist Suresh Naidu from Columbia University. They don't all have to look like film stars, but this is the first one that we show. Suresh talks about the long hockey stick of real wages and about institutional changes, the interaction between institutional changes and biology, talking about what happened in the bubonic plague and then later changes in legislation. So here are a few others of the Economists in Action who have signed up. There's some sense that our students are pretty ignorant about where the ideas that are the basis of economics come from. So we introduce them to a whole series of past economists. You can see that Smith was extremely dismissive of what might possibly be learnt from Oxford. But you can see that in Toulouse he had nothing to do, so he was dead bored here. And that's when he decided to write The Wealth of Nations. We define economics in terms of the way people make their livelihood, their interactions with others, and their interactions with the environment. And we give students work to do. They have to really think if they're doing this course. Here's a discuss question that puts in front of them the Lionel Robbins definition of economics and asks them to think about how that compares with the one that they're being introduced to. A big theme in the way we're teaching from the very beginning is the role of innovation rents or Schumpeterian rents. So they get this little model of the choice of technique, and it's linked to what happened in the Industrial Revolution in England. So here, and again, you can see that with an interactive technology, the students can flick through, they can flick back until they've really understood the concepts. At that stage, they've only seen one person in the economy. We introduced strategic interaction. Now, something that we've come to, we started producing this material in January. We had it reviewed in June, and a strong bit of feedback was that we should have the option of a calculus treatment as well as non-calculus treatment. So we have Leibniz pop-ups that tie directly to the bit of analysis that the students are doing. So I'm getting the 2 minutes, so I'm going to go very swiftly through a few more slides. We talk about a level of description, so that an economic allocation has these two dimensions, a descriptive level and an evaluative level. So again, right from the very beginning, the students are confronted with questions of distribution and of fairness. I will move on. This captures the standard way we present with preferences and technology producing the allocation that's observed. We fill in the gaps by introducing both biology and institutions. This is the introduction to institutions in a unit called Property, Contract and Power, using the actual contract between pirates on 17th century pirate ship, where, by the way, we calculate the Gini Coefficient for them, which was about 0.05. Let me move on. You can just see, this is the modeling of the firm setting the wage. Very same devices that we use all the way through. This leads into macro, effortlessly into macro, so we don't have to have some kind of ad hoc treatment of macro tacked on. Students, I think, who come into economics and have kind of supply-demand see a price, but they're kind of curious, really, about where prices come from. So we have this whole unit on market dynamics, which looks at a series of different ways in which prices can emerge. And this is a very nice example from the 1861 blockade by Lincoln of the Confederate ports. And then, as an activity, the students get to use all of the apparatus that they've worked with up to that point to trace through the messages that are being sent by this price signal originating from those southern ports. We talk about market successes and failures, and I'm getting told to stop. I hope I'm just whetting your appetite. I haven't even got to talking about macro. We can talk about the lessons of the crisis. We have another series throughout the course, which are When Economists Disagree. Here's a very nice one between Farmer and Schiller about whether bubbles exist. The question is who's doing this, who's working on the project. So there's a group of about 25 people that have been slaving away producing this material. We're working with the designers in Bangalore who are making it look very beautiful. Our heads are on the block at UCL. We're starting teaching this next month after UMass Boston starts next week, I think. And then there's a series of other beta testers that will be coming in the new year. This is a list of people who are involved in the project, producing material, appearing as economists in action, from all different countries, from all different orientations across the spectrum in economics. This is the tanker. The question is, can it be turned? It's been turned before. Your first question, are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater? We say no, we're saving the baby from pretty bad bathwater. This is the website. The material will be freely downloadable by everyone. You can get it on your tablet or online towards the end of September. So we hope you'll get in touch and you'll get involved in this project and helping us to produce great new material. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sergey, next.
Thank you. I will not be showing slides, and I will talk about some things that Wendy didn't have time to talk about. So I hope that together we will cover some of the stuff that she had in mind. I will talk about teaching economics for undergrads in emerging markets, based on my experience of running a school in Russia, also teaching economics teachers in Russia and neighboring countries, also helping and cooperating and partnering with economic universities and professors in other emerging markets that also face similar challenges. So I'll say just a few words about why it is much more important to talk about these issues in emerging markets, and then I'll talk about what I think should be taught in emerging markets and how it should be taught. So why does it matter? Why does it matter more to teach economics for undergrads in emerging markets than in developed market economies, OECD countries? The difference is that in most of these countries, especially in post-communist countries, but also in other developing markets, developing countries, the public, that includes policymakers, journalists, pundits, high school teachers, and naturally students, have reasonably little idea how markets actually work. And some of them have grown up in a system where markets were not allowed to operate, and some have grown up in a system where markets were missing or ineffective or didn't exist because of various institutional barriers. And that means that these people have very different beliefs and understanding of what economics is, and teaching undergraduate economics in the right way actually creates a common language and trains voters and the public to discuss economic challenges in an informed way. Economic policies, economic outcomes can be understood in a reasonable way instead of in an ignorant way. And different countries face this challenge of the lack of common ground in a different way. So the elites in, say, Latin America have all been trained in the US, elites in Russia much less so. But that is a big challenge for all emerging markets. So teaching actually matters. And the other challenge is that supply of teachers is very limited. And for undergraduate teaching, of course, we need a lot of teachers. So developing materials like the ones Wendy just described, developing common ground, common curricula in undergraduate economics is very important. People in this audience probably teach more at the master's or graduate level, whereas the problem of supply of teachers is not that great. But in undergraduate teaching, We need a lot of teachers, and we need to train them. We need to help them with the materials, and that, of course, is a huge challenge in emerging markets. Now, why don't existing textbooks perform well in this regard? Now, Wendy mentioned some things. In emerging markets, it's much more important than in developed countries. Why? Because economics must be relevant, and it must be relevant for undergrad students as well. Now, for us, for people who proceed to master's and PhD courses, the undergraduate courses are not that important because these are not last courses in economics we are going to face. So we will take advanced courses and we'll actually know what economics has been doing for the last 30 years. In undergraduate teaching for undergraduate students who will not proceed to become academic economists, these may be the last courses in economics they will ever see. And we need to make sure that we deliver to them what we actually know, in particular about developing countries, which means we need to teach about market failures. We also need to teach about government failures. We need to talk about all these issues that Wendy mentioned: incomplete contracts, developing economics, economics of social interaction, financial imperfections, micro foundations of macro models that include incomplete contracts, financial imperfections, differences in beliefs and expectations, and so on. Why? Because we need to explain to them why governments fail, why markets fail in their own countries, and how to deal with that. And of course, economics has a lot to offer. The problem, of course, is that the models that we have to discuss all these issues now exist at the advanced doctoral level, not at undergraduate level. And this is exactly the challenge. We need to teach what we know, what we've learned in the last 30 years of economic research, in a simple, accessible way to undergrads. And we need to teach these models that on one hand side are simple, on the other hand quite sophisticated to describe the reality. And on top of that, we need to teach the students to use this model. The models should not be just a reflection, a description of reality. We need, I think, one of the biggest challenges is actually to make students feel that they can use this apparatus of modern economics to understand what's going on around them, to talk to policymakers, to understand the policies and the policy failures. And that, of course, is a great challenge. The project that Wendy just described is heading in this direction, but I think it takes more than 25 people, as Wendy rightly said. It takes all of us here to contribute to that. Now, one thing is that we now have the modern technology, and I would like to draw this analogy between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. So the course that Wendy just described is not a MOOC, but it is similar to MOOC because it's kind of interactive, but the content is one for all. It will develop. But at the moment, this is the common resource, which is same for everybody. Now, we know that economics is a social science, and economic interactions, economic policy impact depends on the local institutional context, on the cultural context, and that means that we want to move from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0 and kind of use the wiki principles and harness the power of the teachers on the ground to create local examples, to refer to local data, to actually identify most important, most binding constraints in the economic and social life. And in that sense, I think the main challenge now is not only to create a textbook that would be simple and instrumental enough, something that Wendy is working on in the core project, but also create a mechanism where this system will be kind of working as artificial intelligence using natural intelligence of people using this course, building on the experience and research done on the ground in the emerging markets to make sure that students actually see not only a textbook that describes the US economy or UK economy or French economy, but the economies they actually see themselves. And that of course, makes it even a further challenge, but I think this is the direction we need to go to make economics teaching, especially at the undergraduate level, more effective in emerging markets. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. So while Paul starts speaking, you may want to start preparing some questions, so we would have a lively debate after this. But Paul, you're...
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. I've called my presentation From Guru to Coach to capture what I want to say about the changing nature of the role of economics teachers, and it's about how technology can be transformative, not just of the way we teach, but of the substance and content of what we teach. What I want to cover is 4 points. First of all, to describe the extraordinary cost shock that economics teaching is facing, and to think about it as we might think about a cost shock in some other industry. I want then to highlight the rather startling fact that the response that you might expect to this cost shock, if you were to look at any other industry, does not seem to be materializing in our own industry. That's perhaps because we're one of these protected service industries that we hear so much about, and maybe we're just being slow, but there may be other reasons why the expected response to the cost shock isn't materializing. I then want to talk about what this means for a term that is becoming quite common now in information economics, the role of gatekeepers to information, and in particular to say that teachers are gatekeepers to information, but that the role of gatekeepers is changing as the marginal cost of information is changing, and then summarize in a quick slide what this means for economics teachers in the future. Okay, so what's this cost shock? The cost shock is very simply described. Economics teaching, like most university teaching outside of the subjects that require very expensive lab equipment, like particle physics, essentially has 2 inputs. One of its inputs is digital content. That means books, articles, anything that you can digitize. And it has teacher time. Now, it's a very obvious point, but the marginal cost of digital content has essentially fallen to almost 0 in the last 25 years. But what's happened to the cost of teacher time? Well, the real cost of teacher time is the cost of making teachers. And how do we make teachers? We educate them in colleges. So let me give you a graph which shows that the cost of educating people in colleges, this is based on US data, has increased in real terms by almost 5 times since 1985. And that's really very striking, okay? So that's an index beginning in 1985 going up to 488 by 2011, and the consumer price index rose by about 100%. Actually, so that's not a real, it's a nominal cost increase of 5 times and a real cost increase of about 2.5 times. But this is a very big number. And just like the oil price shock of the early 1970s, we would expect this to lead to a big change in the way in which teaching is organized. What would we expect? We would expect that economics teaching would start to economize drastically on teacher time, and it would use a great deal more digital content. Now, I'm not going to talk about MOOCs, and some of you may want to come back and question that. I think there are things to be said about MOOCs in this context, but if you go around the amphitheaters of universities in Europe and North America, what will you actually see? You will see PowerPoint that has replaced blackboards and then whiteboards, and you will see longer reading lists. But that's pretty much it. And that seems a remarkably slow response to this absolutely massive cost shock. Now, what are the reasons, apart from the cynical reason that we are in some sense a protected profession? I think there are 2 reasons. One is that what I've just said to you about the marginal cost of digital content being 0 is actually false. The financial marginal cost of digital content is indeed 0, but the true marginal cost of using digital content is very far from 0. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the second and important fact, which actually arises from the first, is that these 2 inputs, teacher time and digital content, are not substitutes. So if we come to this industry with intuitions formed from doing too much Cobb-Douglas thinking in our micro of the producer side of the economy, then we're going to forget that these 2 inputs being complements are actually going to respond in a very different way. Let me expand briefly on that. So why is the true marginal cost of digital content much higher than 0? The fundamental reason is the scarce attention of the user, the scarce attention of the student, the user of the internet, even the teacher. What that means is, by themselves, longer reading lists are typically less and not more informative than shorter reading lists. Because with a longer reading list, you have a real difficulty in knowing how to prioritize the elements on the reading list and knowing how they relate to each other. A very simple test is that very clearly the marginal blog post on economic subjects subtracts rather than adds value. And it does so for at least two different reasons. One is that the more blog posts there are on economic subjects, the more difficult it is for individuals to work out which blog post they should trust. Secondly, it's very likely that the marginal blog post is of lower quality than the average blog post. Again, think about this as an industry with very, very low cost of entry, so the marginal blogger is probably getting some private benefits out of this, and they're imposing a major externality on others. So the decline in the statistical quality of the blog post pool is actually a significant marginal cost of the arrival on the scene of the marginal blog post. And then actually a third reason, which is that many blog posts spend their time telling you, often misleadingly, how stupid the other bloggers are. I will actually mention one, perhaps unfairly, because it's a blogger whom I much admire, but Brad DeLong, in his very well-known blog post that many of you will know, regularly has an award for the stupidest person alive. Now, given the number of times he changes the awardee, one would have thought he might have thought of a different title for it. But in other words, he spends a lot of his time telling you how extremely useless are the other blogs that you might read. And you can imagine a kind of war, a contest of escalation in which different bloggers spend a lot of their time telling you essentially what a waste of time you are undertaking in reading other blog posts. Now, what does this all add up to? It all adds up to the fact that more information here is often less understanding. Now, what do you do? What's the solution for all of us? None of us goes onto the internet directly and unprotected. We all go onto the internet typically with some gatekeepers to help us. The gatekeepers could be search engines. The gatekeepers could be friends who recommend things to us. The gatekeepers could be our teachers. And essentially, in a world of scarce attention, all users of information need gatekeepers to help them. Now, once you think of the gatekeeper and the information as complementary inputs rather than as substitute inputs, an important insight comes out of this, which is that the true shadow cost of getting extra information is not just the financial cost of acquiring the information, which is often zero, it's the implied cost of the extra gatekeeper time that you need to help you to process and assess that information. So once you treat the inputs as complements rather than substitutes, there's an additional implied cost that you have to add into the shadow cost of new information. And all of that means that essentially the insight that digital content has zero marginal cost is seriously misleading. Digital content has very high shadow marginal cost. And we need gatekeepers more than ever. Okay, so what do these gatekeepers do? In a very simple world where there's quite a lot of information around, but the powers of the gatekeepers are almost limitless, we think of gatekeepers as screeners of information. There's too much information out there, we can't process it all, so what do? We get somebody else to process it for us. Well, that, of course, relies on the supply of people who are capable of producing it, of processing all of that information, and as we all know, such people no longer exist. The web is just too large for everybody to process it. Now, I'm old enough to recall a time when my undergraduate economics teachers were screeners of information. They were people who just knew far more than I knew. They knew everything about the subject of their lectures, and I went there and I hoped one day that I might know perhaps 80% or perhaps, if I was very lucky, 90% of what these very brilliant and wise people knew. And they were the people who, in a sense, knew what there was to know. You only have to spend 5 minutes looking at the Core Project website or listening to Wendy to realize that the combined content of wisdom and insight in that course is far more than any individual can know. Even Wendy doesn't know it all. She relies on the fact that there is contribution to this from a large number of people who know a great deal about economic history, about conditions in developing economies, about econometrics, about a whole range of subjects, about institutions in the Middle Ages and so forth. And what you would need to know everything in the course is far greater than any single gatekeeper can give. What that means is that now the role of the teachers has evolved from being the people who pre-screen things to tell you what you need to know, to the coaches and advisors and friends who help you along in the process of exploring that world for you. And that involves not just, in fact, it certainly doesn't involve digesting everything before you have to do so, because no individual can do that. It involves teaching you skills of the evaluation and the use of information, and teaching you ways of thinking about strategies for finding new information, rather than having pre-digested all of the information for you. Now, what does that mean for economics teachers? It means that we need to accept that in any reasonably well-taught course, most students will, by the first 2 or 3 weeks, come to know far more than their teachers know. Now, you know, that could be a threat. If we rely, either for our economic rents or for our self-esteem, on knowing more than our students, then this source of rent and of self-esteem is going to be eroded very fast. I'm sure all of you will have had the experience of having students who, in the first or second row of the class, by week 2 of the class, have really overtaken you in the understanding of a number of the subjects you're teaching. Personally, I find that an empowering and a liberating experience, but it can be scary, and I think all of us who teach economics, in a sense, have to get used to that rather scary experience. Importantly, for the motivation and recruitment of teachers, it means we have to think about how to make that activity attractive, because there's no doubt that being a guru is glamorous. And indeed, I think in the essentially Soviet-style economic systems that are university departments, where teaching is done essentially at a very low price, because the central planning authority demands that we do teach in certain ways, glamour has been one of the few ways in which the difficult and challenging task of teaching undergraduates has been made possible. You put gifted teachers in front of undergraduate students in the hope that they will find it glamorous. And that is going to be much harder to do, because teaching search and analysis skills is, let's face it, given our existing value systems, less glamorous than pretending you know far more than any of the students in your class will ever know. I don't know the answer to that, but it means that I think that we probably need to think much harder about the motivation of teachers, rather than relying, as we did informally in the past, on the idea that teaching is just glamorous. I leave you with a question. Is this going to increase or decrease the returns from bundling teaching and research? I like to think that those skills in teaching, the search and analysis skills which we have to teach for students, are also valuable skills in research. Whether university departments are going to follow that logic and continue to encourage the best researchers to get involved in undergraduate teaching, I don't know, but I very much hope they will. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So I'd like now to invite questions. Please, short and sharp questions rather than long interventions. There is one question from there. So I will be brutal if someone speaks long. So
okay.
Let you know.
So my question is about general kind of what is that we are teaching, because my feeling with this, what exactly should we teach, is that people try to come up with the set of correct answers to put into this enema of knowledge, and to put that enema into people's heads and give them the correct answers to everything. Whereas when we do research, we are awarded not for being correct or giving facts, whereas being smart about doing stuff. So maybe if we are supposed to be good by research, from being smart, we should also teach students to be smart. And well, if that's our comparative advantage, why don't we do that instead of having a collection of facts. So my question is, what do you think should be the thing that we taught the students?
Thank you. Okay. So let me bring my own quick reflection on after Wendy's presentation. I thought it was quite fascinating what you put together. I think what we normally don't do is to highlight how interesting and lively the debate is among ourselves within the economic profession. And I think that I really applaud of something that looked good very much in that direction. I mean, if you think about macroeconomics, you know, which I admittedly I've never taught at undergraduate level, in many places you still have you know, standard ISLM models that are very far from the way we do our own research. So that's very dry. And I also, that's one extreme of conservatism. The other is taking mainstream economics and showing by a bunch of facts and experiments or evidence that it doesn't work. I think that both such extremes are way too common in the way we currently teach in economics. And the exciting part would be to make people understand that there is a very lively debate of ideas and make them participate into that. So maybe more a reflection, but maybe you can say more than about the way you're trying to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that captures very much the motivation of the people who've been working on the project, which is that the practice of doing economics is extremely lively. It's extremely constructive. Economists are being asked all the time to provide advice, to provide quantitative answers to very important public policy questions. For example, whether we should put, if we were trying to deal with obesity, how should a tax be designed that would be most effective in giving an answer to that? And I think the aim should be that we teach our students, we enthuse our students about the power of economics to play a role in public policy across a huge spectrum. That was just, you know, one small example. And we need to provide them with a framework with which they can understand the economy in which they're embedded. So what Sergei said, I think, is absolutely right. And what we've tried to do in the project is to create a kind of a framework drawing on the innovations that have happened over the past few decades, but then to use that as a kind of backbone, if you like, for people who are teaching in different environments. So the one that Sergei sketched of, for example, teaching in an economy where the rule of law is weak. So it's on the basis of the foundations that we lay, then it's possible to create local teaching modules or units, if you like, that will allow the students in their own economy to see the power of economic argument and to learn how to communicate and to participate in the public policy debates in their own setting. So that's the kind of twin ambition that we have for the project.
Yeah, Margaret has something to
Okay. Well, I agree with all that Wendy says, but let me add, I'm not sure we should be prescriptive about what we teach. I certainly don't see that as the role of the EEA. I would say that teach something you're excited about. Right? Teach something from your research. Try and pitch it at a level where you can enthuse the students that they were there. Show how you think about applications or applications that are directly relevant to the students. I'm starting my intermediate micro lectures by talking about the probability of success of internship applications, because that is what all my students are doing, and I want to persuade them that they should be thinking at the margin, and that actually the marginal gain is pretty small once you get past about 5. Right? So take it from there, I think. Also, the other thing that I find I need to do is to talk to my colleagues. I'm teaching intermediate micro, so I need to be talking to people doing the first year course. what do the students know? Now, what the students know is very different from what they've been taught, an experience that we all have. And then I'm also laying foundations for things later on. So I think keeping up a conversation with colleagues, we tend to sit in bunkers, and we need to be doing that more. And both colleagues in the same university, but also colleagues elsewhere.
So can I invite some more question or quick reflection from the audience? There is at least one question there, maybe, and one down here. Yeah. Let's go there first and then come.
I was interested to know, what do you think about the recent
It's not very
rise
easy
in
to hear.
popularity of, let's say, popular literature? Now more and more students come to study economics because they have read, let's say, free economics, or they have read some other books that provide very accessible and interesting treatment of the economics, finance as well. But this also creates quite a lot of problems in teaching them, because I've seen a lot of students coming to the classes after reading, let's say, The Black Swan, and they think that they know all about finance. The same happened with a bit of econometrics, the same happened with other empirical, like, sort of courses. So what is the best way to strike a balance between formal teaching, between, fundamental research and strict approach to getting results, and this popularized, simplified treatment of the matters?
Thank you. There was a question down here. Here. Can you have a mic here? Oh, okay, thank you. Actually, the acoustic is not ideal, so speak slowly and loud as much as you can.
Okay, hello. I just wanted to ask, probably before you start speaking about content of what you teach, probably, so I see a problem because a good researcher is not necessarily a good teacher. And I think that universities and schools are encouraged to do research. That's how they get their financing, as I see it. So before speaking about content, probably we should speak about how to encourage really teaching, because that's something that is not valued, especially about undergraduate education. As I noticed, undergraduates usually are treated like everyone can teach anything to them. Any PhD student can teach any undergraduate, and now I think a good PhD researcher who also can teach well is really a success. It's a luck. You're really happy when you see such a person. So a question, how you really can encourage teaching, because now it's only research that encouraged, and it doesn't matter what teacher you are if you're a good researcher.
Let me take a round of answers on this. This seems quite interesting, couple of questions. So please, Wendy, and then maybe Sergey and Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the starting points for this project was precisely that any well-trained PhD student could step off a plane anywhere in the world and walk into the classroom and teach a standard course. So a standard course out of Varian or one of the well-known textbooks. They wouldn't even particularly have to know where they were. They could do it because the material's very standardized, it's context-free. And given the incentives facing that young person, then they would have been very well advised to do that, but may have felt rather dissatisfied, and their students may not have appreciated the course as much as would be possible. So one thing that we're trying to do is to produce some material, a different way of teaching Introduction to Economics, to produce it in an accessible online form, and to really take on some of the ideas that Paul was putting forward, which was, obviously there's a huge effort that goes into producing new teaching material, and what's I think what's now possible is that if you produce the material, you curate the material, you do this gatekeeper role, and then you have a resource that you can assign to students, you can set them some questions to do ahead of when they appear before you in the classroom. And again, as Paul suggested, you, the young lecturer, really desperately concentrating on their research, doesn't have to be the expert. You can pick some aspects, say even from that first unit on the capitalist revolution. You could decide to teach measures of inequality, for example. You could decide to teach how do we compare levels of GDP per capita across countries, really focusing on some of the key measurement issues that economists need to know. And meanwhile, you're assigning your students to work through the interactive material, you're checking that they understand it, you're organizing sections where they're taking up some of those discussed questions. So you're kind of flipping the classroom around and making use of electronic technology to take a lot of the burden off a lecturer in deciding to use exciting material. So it won't any longer, I think, be a choice. Either you teach something well packaged, completely standard, and have plenty of time to get on with your research, or you somehow set your research aside and dedicate yourself to creating a great course. I think we can, using new technology, we can deliver something better than that.
Thank you, Wendy. Sergey.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I think these are two related questions, and they're very important. And I think I would like to say that it is not a coincidence that there is a shortage of good teachers come researchers. Because, and Paul showed the cost of training a new professor in economics has gone up. There is a reason, there are actually two reasons. One is the growth of demand for economics in the world in general, mostly from emerging economies, some emerging economies within EU, some countries have rediscovered that economics works, or lack of good economics actually does bad things to your micro and macro. So there is a demand for modern economics all over the world. And on top of that, there is a general success of economics. Students prefer to learn economics rather than some other disciplines. And so we are in trouble. As a former university administrator, I can tell you it's hard to find good teachers and researchers. Now, I'm on the other side. I'm very happy. And it's good for everybody in this room that there is a shortage, there is a deficit of good teachers and researchers that will bring you rents, whether you're a guru or coach, whether you're good or bad. This is a profession where the demand is growing really fast. So I think whatever we do, however sophisticated the technology is, Wendy was talking about, we will always have complaints that we don't have enough time to invest in our course. University administrators will always complain that professors don't pay enough attention to teaching, simply because we are in this game where supply of teachers is short all over the world, and especially in emerging markets. And I think given that we still need human capital, coaches, gatekeepers, that means that this problem has no easy solution. I think we'll still have graduate students teaching because professors already are busy teaching. So,
I think in the traditional value systems in universities, a huge amount of prestige has attached to two qualities, which nowadays I think are greatly overrated as qualities of teachers. One is being very smart, and the other one is being very knowledgeable. And certainly when I was being taught, I was persuaded that my teachers were both very much smarter than I was and very much more knowledgeable than I was, and the aim was to kind of try and close some of the gap with them. One of the persistent difficulties in attracting good researchers into teaching is that very often those goals are incompatible. In order to become very smart, the teacher has, like, say, a brilliant violin teacher, to concentrate on just practicing the scales again and again, learning how to do something very, very well. And that allocation of time is incompatible with, at the same time, becoming very knowledgeable. So many of the researchers face a choice. They say, well, if good teaching requires me to be very knowledgeable, in order to do my research, I want to become very smart. I can't do both, and so I'm going to neglect my teaching. In the world made possible by these new technologies, as Wendy has shown us, fortunately, you don't have to be either very smart or very knowledgeable to be a very good teacher. You can be a good coach. Just as, say, a good voice coach for an opera singer doesn't have to be a great opera singer. What they have to do is they have to understand opera singers and what makes them tick and what motivates them, and they have to be able to help opera singers become even better. Great voice coaches can be just that, great voice coaches. And I think great teachers of economics can be inspiring and motivating for their students without having to be either very smart or very knowledgeable. Now, as I say, for people who get their kicks from and their sense of glamour from claiming to be smarter or more knowledgeable than their students, that will be a disappointment. But I hope for most of the rest of us in the middle, it's actually an opening up of opportunity.
I work a lot with graduate students who are teaching classes for the course I lecture. And one thing that comes across very clearly is how transferable the skills you need to develop as a teacher are to particularly successfully presenting your research. I mean, at the most basic level, you have to do it in English. And we actually provide special training for that, learning to manage a group, simply not being too nervous in front of a group. So I think that these things are actually quite complementary. Another thing I would say is that undergraduate teaching, and the more basic the level, the more this is true, is much, much harder than graduate teaching. I actually disagree about simply pulling out Varian, because you have to understand something and explain something without using any of your technical apparatus. And actually that act is something which certainly for me has made me rethink things, has made me pose questions that I otherwise wouldn't have seen, because I can't bring on the full technical apparatus. So I think seeing, yes, there's a time allocation issue, but there is also a complementarity. And then, but yes, also we have to ask about incentives for doing this, and we, as economists, we know about incentives.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I want to emphasize, since we are going towards a conclusion, that we don't view as a European Economic Association this as a unique single event, and then next year we talk about something completely different. But we rather would like to turn this into regular commitment to discuss issues related to education, maybe in a different format, maybe narrowing down next time some specific issues. But I think that this is an important part of our mission, and we would like to continue, and I hope I'll have most of you here next year as well. Thank you very much.